The parallels with Orwell's 1984 are incredible.
The Matrix series, the actual the trilogy starring Keanu Reeves.
Hello and welcome to Better Read Than Dead, the Generation Liberty podcast show. Thank you for joining us again. Today we are going to be discussing an absurdist masterpiece called The Foundation Pit by Andrei Platonov. This is probably the most obscure book on our list, but also one of the most important, I think. The novel follows the journey of Soviet workers as they dig a foundation pit for a future housing. Throughout the book, they slowly lose the meaning of what they're doing. And it is a very intriguing novel, and I am so glad that we are joined today by Jonathan Kay from Quillette. He is a Quillette senior editor. He's also the host of the Quillette podcast show, and he's the author of many, many books. Thank you for joining us, Jonathan.
Thanks for having me.
And from our Generation Liberty team, we have our favourite medical student, Peumike. Thank you for joining us again.
Very happy to be on, Renee. Very excited for this book and can't wait to get started.
Jonathan, you chose this novel from the list that we gave you, and you told me at the time it was because you were trying to get through more Russian literature. How did you find the book, and how did you find it compared to other Russian literature that you've perhaps been reading?
Just before you had emailed me, I had just finished reading a play, a very different piece of Russian literature. I believe it was called The Inspector General, considered a great classic of Russian literature. It's a comedy. It's by Gogol. And I remember reading it and thinking, like, how is it that I'm this old and I haven't read this masterpiece? And so it was at that time that I said, well, I'm going to use this pandemic to read some more Russian literature. Of course, many of us are familiar with War and Peace and Crime and Punishment, but I was looking to get a little bit beyond that. And I had not heard of The Foundation Pit. I don't want to present myself as somehow knowing of this great masterpiece and revisiting it. I was reading it for the first time, and I actually found it a stunning book, just really good. So many modern themes jumped out, but also as somebody who has always enjoyed and appreciated the work of George Orwell. I mean, there were certain themes in here that, well, I don't know that Orwell stole them. I mean, I know that Orwell was influenced by a book called We, which is by Yevgeny Zamyatin, was this dystopian book, and that's widely known. But there are some things in this book that I think Orwell must have borrowed as well, because they're so similar to some of the things. I mean, the style of writing is very different. Orwell was not a surrealist, but it's eerie how much they have in common.
Jonathan, one of the things I also found when researching this was that most of the absurdism was based in reality, and some of the weirdest elements in the book were actually based in truth. So, for example, the kulaks being placed on a raft in one segment of the book and sent down a river, there is actually records of that actually occurring. And a more bizarre one was that Platonov's brother later said later that there was a tame bear in the village that they grew up in. So there's some of these really absurdist parts are actually based in historical truth. What did you find while reading it and looking at the history? And what did you think of him taking history and presenting it as both absurd but also kind of true at the same time?
What's interesting is that unlike, say, Orwell, who was quite disillusioned in communism and maybe even to some extent socialism more generally at the time he wrote his best-known books. My understanding is that Platonov actually, I mean, he did believe in socialism, and I think from what I understand, he believed in communism, as we would now call it, as we would still call it. But he was just very much opposed to the cruel and ruthless and suppressive way that it was being implemented under Stalin. And I mean, I'm a little older than some of the other participants on this in this panel, but I remember in the 80s, people still use some of the vocabulary that is contained in the book, talking about deviationism and capitalists and the bourgeoisie, and the need to cleanse society of these influences. What was different under Stalin, of course, was that when they talked about ridding society of the kulaks as a class, so kulaks were seen as petty bourgeoisie, this was often took the form of actual extermination, or at least dispossessing people and leaving them homeless, and sort of these pitiful scenes that are in the books of people whose livestock is taken away and animals are taken away, and they're herded into these collective farms. I mean, that very much did happen, and in some cases, particularly in Ukraine, that cost millions of lives. The genius of the book is that this horrendous backstory, mass murder, collectivization, the uprooting of an entire society, exterminating whole groups of people, is presented in a way that is darkly comic. I mean, you would think this kind of material would be uniquely unsuitable to comedy, but there were parts of the book, and I think it's because of his use of language, contrasting these ridiculous slogans with this sort of very kind of primitive folk understandings and ideas about like sleep and food and sex that ordinary people still talk about it, but they're talking about these basic human needs in the language of class struggle. He was very conscious about how ridiculous that kind of vocabulary was to talk about basic human needs. And often the humor arises from that. But the scenes are quite wrenching. And I mean, the ending is incredibly sad. But the genius of it is that as a reader, you're not sure in some scenes whether to be miserable or to laugh at it. And I mean, how many writers can pull that kind of thing off? It's quite a masterpiece.
And Peumike, what did you learn about this period while reading, and how did you find the presentation of the absurd in contrast to the kind of true and deeply sad?
Well, simply, it was a brutal history. It was a bloody history. It was a violent history. But the way that Platonov depicted it, as we've mentioned before, the ridiculousness of it, the absurdity of it, the darkness of it, I think was important because it presented it in a way that was accessible, but also allowed it to clear up any confusion that this was quite a horrid period of time. I think that when you're trying to express obviously morally abhorrent messages, you need a bit of that humour sometimes to clearly express what is right and what is wrong. And I think how Platonov, in using the style that he did at the end, it was blatantly clear that collectivism or Stalinist collectivism was bad, and that not necessarily private ownership, but having some kind of independence was a good thing. And I think in that way, in the way that he wrote, the style that he wrote, he was able to achieve that. And if he didn't have that style, I don't think it would have been that accessible. If it wasn't as exaggerated, if it wasn't as clear, I think that there would have still been quite a bit of confusion out there. So the style served its purpose and it achieved it to great success, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think you really touched on some interesting points there. I think you said it needs humour to a degree to discuss something so dark. I also think that it needed an element of madness and this kind of surreal nature that almost didn't make sense, because the Stalinist regime at the time was so brutal that it almost didn't make sense, that it was kind of beyond the rational, what was happening. So I think that style really, really suited it. And I think it was when I was looking into this book, someone was discussing that you needed someone slightly mad like Platonov to describe the madness of what was going on. But Jonathan, you kind of touched on that a little bit, that he was a communist, but this book is, critical, or at least reflective of the brutality of Stalinism. What do you think he is trying to say about Stalinism in the novel?
So one interesting thing is that we often situate literature like this in the debate between capitalism and communism more broadly. But Platonov wrote his book at a time when there was a very important division within communist cadres about the correct way to, to implement communism. In the book, there's all these denunciations of the so-called kulaks, sort of petty property owners. Often people who were denounced as kulaks were actually just ordinary farmers who had some private farming possessions. And we now, in stereotyped communism was like poor people versus rich people. Stalin himself was highly suspicious of farmers and peasants more generally, because he saw them as vestiges of a czarist pastoral agricultural culture that he wanted to eliminate in favor of a more romantic proletarian culture based on cities, based on heavy industry. And the 1920s, and I'd say the late 1920s in particular, until Stalin really centralized the levers of state power under his direction in the early 1930s, you had people like Bukharin and Lenin, when Lenin was still alive, who were much more balanced in their approach and were more compassionate toward peasants and small landowners as they were being integrated into this totalizing communist ideal. Stalin was not like that at all. For him, class warfare really was a form of warfare and was completely ruthless, and not just against peasants and kulaks, but against ethnic minorities in the Caucasus who he deemed to be inconvenient to his plans. Obviously, millions of people dead in Ukraine. So this isn't just an attack on communism. More broadly, it's an attack on a particular interpretation of communism that says that every aspect of individualism has to be exterminated, including individual land ownership, individual business operation, individual consciousness. I mean, the main character, the protagonist, his entire struggle is within his own consciousness, the development of individual consciousness. And by the end, there's this sort of joyless, mirthful approach that he and others have where they've extinguished their individuality, and they, there's this pantomime of joy that they express, like how, at one point he says, well, I'm so happy now I've been reduced to nothing because everything has been collectivized. I have nothing left of my soul. So it's not just a dark parable of communism more generally, which Platonov, was sympathetic to, but a satire of a particularly ruthless, totalizing kind of communist utopianism, which like many utopian movements manifests itself in the most unimaginable kind of cruelties. And that's the absurdism that, as horrifying as it is, that gulf between utopian rhetoric and grim reality, that gulf is so vast that out of that can come a certain grim kind of absurdist humor, which Platonov does a wonderful job of capturing.
I would like to know your thoughts on the comparison between this and Orwell. As you said, this has kind of been compared to the works of Orwell, particularly 1984, because they both kind of depict a state-controlled dystopia. What similarities really stuck out to you whilst reading this?
Orwell's most widely read masterpieces, Animal Farm and 1984 in particular, are essentially post-socialist, almost post-communist books, whereas this almost reads to me like a post-Christian book, where Orwell was showing the apocalyptic deficiencies in hard left politics and how it leads to the state. And he was an analyst who showed how language explained, the principles of Ingsoc, as he called it, the principles of newspeak. And in fact, my edition of 1984 actually has an appendix, which is about the principles of newspeak. And yes, it's science fiction, but it's science fiction written by an essayist, because Orwell, spent most of his life as an essayist, not just writing books. Whereas Platonov gets to much the same place, but he's the opposite of an essayist. He has no interest in writing sort of a linear, explanatory essay. He wants to show you what happens to the human soul. And so it feels way more like a sort of cri de coeur. Like when you're reading this book, because it's written in sort of dreamlike, surrealist state, in a weird way, you actually identify maybe a little bit more with the characters. I mean, when Winston Smith, when terrible things happened to Winston Smith in 1984, although I love that book, I felt curiously detached from it because Orwell is such an analytical writer, and it almost does feel like sort of a science fiction version of an essay. Whereas Platonov is so deeply interested in suffering and the human condition, and how it's suffocated under this kind of communism, um, that it had more of a spiritual feel to it. It felt like the human spirit being snuffed out. And again, Orwell got to the same place, but he got to it through in a much more analytical, almost like political theorizing way. So it's fascinating to compare the two books together because they get to the same place, but through such stylistically divergent ways. It's really interesting.
I kind of would describe it as Platonov kind of uses the language of the human spirit to talk about the dystopian nature of the state, whilst Orwell uses the dystopian state language to talk about the human experience. So there's
That's interesting. Yeah, they reverse it. Yeah, they get to the same place.
They get to the same place, but it's reversed, and there's a little bit more humanism in Platonov because he's starting from that human place. I also found a lot of similarities, and as in, I don't find either of them to be lecturing or moralizing, more just presenting a reflection of what could be. I think that's we discussed this last week about Orwell. A lot of people want to take Orwell and say, he's on our side and he's saying this. But you should always use Orwell as a mirror to kind of reflect on and see what the world is becoming. And I think Platonov has that a little bit too. But Fumikas, what connections did you find between Orwell and Platonov?
Yeah, I agree with both the connections that you, Renee, and Jonathan have raised, and I see the superficial points as well in having a state control degrading individuality, and also the idea of community surveillance as well, I think was another theme that echoed between both books. But I think perhaps the most profound theme, especially for me, that resonated in both books was the idea of wholeness, or the appreciation of wholeness, and that's something that Voshev was talking about. And you might be wondering, oh, Peumike, that's quite vague. What does wholeness mean? But to be fair, that's how Voshev and how the Foundation Pit depicted wholeness. It appeared more as the meaning of life, or the wholeness of the universe, or the truth of the universe. And in that respect, I don't see it as actually finding what the meaning of life is, but having the privilege or the ability to be able to philosophize, to think about those kind of questions. And collectivism in the Foundation Pit and Newspeak in 1984, they're both mechanisms in which the state prevented that kind of philosophization, that kind of thinking, which is at the essence of what I believe distinguishes humans, from animals. That's what I think is intrinsic to a human being, that we're able to think of those bigger concepts. And it's what Voshev was incessantly searching for throughout the book. What is the wholeness? Where is the bigger picture? And we often don't see that bigger picture, and people don't entertain those thoughts. And I think, to be honest, that's one of the greatest shames in both 1984 and the Foundation Pit, that people aren't even able to contemplate the idea of wholeness or seeking wholeness. So if there was one theme that resonated between both of those two, it would be that concept of wholeness. And it's a real pity that even in today's day and age, that idea of philosophization is not even entertained by a lot of the public.
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting thing to compare between the two, and I really understand what you're saying. But I think we've touched a lot on the language in this book. We talked about newspeak in the concept of Orwell, and also the use of kind of political doublespeak in this novel as well. And here on Better Read Than Dead, we always like to talk about these books and how we can kind of compare them to what is happening in a modern context. And it really struck me, while reading this book, as you were saying, Jonathan, the huge gap between some of this political language and the utopianism that it's reaching for and the reality of how it's implemented and how it's used. I couldn't help thinking of some of the really weird language being used in academia these days, on political campuses, whether it be, critical race theory, how we talk about privilege, or intersectionality. And I couldn't help thinking that everyone at university should be reading this book as to give them an understanding of where this could lead, but that a very interesting kind of modern version of this book could be set at a university campus and could be switching out some of the language of the proletariat and communist language with this new kind of social justice warrior language, even though, of course, the ramifications of both are vastly different. But Jonathan, did you find any connection to what is going on now and the use of language and this book, and how Platonov is using language?
Yeah, well, in both cases, this is the 1920s in the Soviet Union and now, and I guess this is very common, is that there's this tribalizing concept of people who have been who have the correct form of thinking. So in the in the book, they call it being a conscious citizen. The idea being that you've internalized the precepts of Soviet communism, and you are fully conscious and fully aware. And there's often this debate between, when they're having some petty argument, the workers, one of them will accuse the other of not being a fully conscious citizen, which is code for saying, not only are you wrong about this, but in your wrongness, you are exhibiting signs of ideological heresies. And there's always, as there is now, the threat of informing on one another. So it's actually, if I could, there was this one section I wanted to read. So one of the most interesting characters is Zashev, and Zashev is he's sometimes called Comrade Cripple. He's a military veteran who doesn't do much work, but he's always calling other people out for being lackeys of the kulaks, and he gets away with everything, including at one point abusing the wife of Pushkin, who I think that's his name, Pashkin, who at the time was his own supervisor, because Pashkin had been reported for some sort of ideological peccadillo before. He doesn't want to be reported again. And then at one point, Zashev he's upbraiding someone else, and he says, "Don't you dare to think whatever comes into your head, or are you looking for a trip down river? We'll get you on the raft before you know it." And basically saying to this fellow communist apparatchik, just because you're an official doesn't mean that I can't denounce you, and you'll be on the raft with the kulaks. That you're always just one denunciation away from sharing the fate of the people who have already been excommunicated. And the guest was now frightened that he had come. This is a sort of a peasant who had come to the this joyous event, the sending off the kulaks. And he says, "I won't think nothing anymore, Comrade Cripple. I'll just whisper from now on," which sort of bespeaks this self-annihilation you often see on social media, where someone's been called out and they say, "Well, I'll stop taking up space and I'll just go off and do the work and be silent and I won't say anything anymore." This idea of being able to not just denounce an idea, but denounce a human being on the basis that they have contaminated ideas. This this is obviously something that is as true now as it was then, and it's true of all highly dogmatic ideological movements, because they tend to divide the world between those who are believers, who are so-called conscious citizens or fully woke in the modern terminology, and those who are still laboring under a kind of, as Marxists once called it, false consciousness. And that aspect of it is certainly as prevalent now in certain subcultures as it was 100 years ago.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And particularly that segment of the book you pulled out, I could just imagine a similar scenario happening on social media or on a university campus. And you've kind of have witnessed it, where people who were kind of seen as ideologically pure be fall on their own sword by saying the wrong thing or being taken down by someone else. But Peumike, did you find any similarities while reading this book between some of the language and social and cultural things happening now and the book?
Well, I think Jonathan definitely hit the nail on the head when he was talking about how almost religious-like, how cult-like the far left, particularly on campus, have grouped themselves to a point in which anyone who has any differing opinion is not only entitled to that opinion, but is seen as lower immediately because they are not a subscriber to the faith of the far left, for example. That's something that's definitely prevalent and was evident with Zashev, but also that's something that struck me was how the bureaucracy used their language in the Foundation Pit. There was an almost hypocrisy or contradiction in a lot of the speech that they were using, which reminded me a lot of the concepts that the far left use when talking about victimhood or about how everything will be okay, but let's burn the world to the ground first. The hypocrisy, the contradiction in their speech, because what they're saying sounds so great, sounds so pure, so amazing, but in reality, it's quite disastrous what they're proposing. So I can see both what Jonathan's saying about how the grouping of people down into different ideological groups devalues those who aren't in those groups, and also how the language by the bureaucracy in the novel is symbolic of the contradictory nature of much of the radical left we see today.
But as we come to the end of the discussion of this book, we've talked about all the important themes and the language in this book and its uniqueness. Jonathan, if you're going to give us some of the main reasons that you think that our audience or anyone should really seek this book out and read it.
I think it goes to the fundamental question of, I think the most important limitation that exists on any system of political philosophy, which is basically the fact that politics and ideology ultimately are not what make us happy. What makes us happy are our human connections and the things we strive for and achieve in life and the connections we make in life. And any political philosophy that tells you that it is going to satisfy you, that it is an end in itself, that it is going to deliver what matters in the world, to me, that's a false god. Because the job of politics is to enable humans to become happy and satisfied. They are not ends in and of itself. And I think that's one of Platonov's messages, which is that everyone in the book had convinced themselves that building this foundation pit is what would make them happy. But it's a materialist goal. And by the way, I think that same critique goes to capitalism. Capitalism gives us the tools we need to build happy, healthy, successful lives. But capitalism itself is not what makes us happy. It's not what should make us happy. Material wealth ultimately is not what should make us happy. These are enabling mechanisms to allow humans to strive for what Voshev wants, which is to feel whole. We've been talking about that, to feel connected, to feel valuable to others, to serve others. And if those basic human needs are replaced by a totalizing agenda based on politics or ideology, that's a false goal, and it's one we should reject, whether it comes under the guise of communism or any other totalizing creed. That to me is the message of 1984 communicated that message, but this book, Foundation Pit, communicates it in a language, its own unique, wonderful, surrealist, maddening language that I'm not sure there's any other book that touched me in that way.
Oh, I think that's really true. And I think what you're saying is very particularly poignant for the moment. I think one of the problems right now is that politics is kind of saturating all aspects of life, and a lot of people are, finding it hard to distinguish between the political and what's really important, which is those human connections. So I think this is a really, really poignant novel for the moment. But Peumike, why would you say particularly young people should read this novel?
Well, Jonathan touched on the idea of not seeing things as a means to an end, but an ends in and of itself. And I think that doesn't resonate any more so than in the idea of work and the essence of work. And I think young people nowadays see work or see study in particular as a means to an end, as opposed to appreciating the process of it itself. It kind of relates back to something which forms the core of our Australian Way of Life program that we have at the IPA, relating to the dignity of work and how that forms a pivotal part of the Australian way of life. And I think that's something that young people in particular have to appreciate and need to appreciate if they want to be more fulfilled in their activities. But also, I think it serves as a warning against collectivisation and the kind of groupthink that we see on campuses in particular, and the need to stay away from that kind of mentality. But also another reason why people should read The Foundation Pit is because of the challenge itself. I had a lot of fun reading The Foundation Pit. It's a challenge, but I think it's something that everyone should take on. It helps improve critical analysis, critical thinking, and I learned a lot about Russian history. So, of course, we have the thematic elements there about why it's important to understand the essence of things, about why we should be skeptical of centralisation and collectivism. But also, it's just a lot of fun to read and a great challenge to take on.
Yeah, I think that's really true. This was probably the most unique reading experience out of all the books that we've been covering on Book Club, but I'm definitely glad that I went through it, and I encourage everyone watching this show to really dig down and get through this book, because it is worth it at the end of the day. But we're coming to the end of our show, but I'm going to do what I do at the end of every show and ask both of my guests to recommend another book or another work of art that they think you would enjoy if you enjoyed The Foundation Pit. So, Jonathan, what would you recommend our audience consume if they liked The Foundation Pit?
You know, I'm going to recommend a book that I mentioned in passing, which is the undeservedly obscure masterpiece We by Yevgeny Zamyatin. Interestingly, Zamyatin, I believe he himself was also an engineer formerly. Certainly the hero of his book is an engineer. And it's also written in a slightly surrealistic style. Not as much, it's not as challenging. It's more of an action movie type book, but the parallels with Orwell's 1984 are incredible. And I mean, I think Orwell himself acknowledged that he had read Zamyatin's We, but I think the pandemic in general is a great opportunity to look at the classics of Russian literature. My mother was once she spent 6 months in a sickbed when she was a kid, and she used it to read the classics of Russian literature. And I think it made up for the illness. Hopefully the people reading this aren't in a sickbed, but still, what a unique opportunity we have during lockdown, at least here in Canada. In Australia, you're doing better than us, but use these months to read the masterpieces of Russian literature, because there are many, but that's one to start with, We by Zamyatin.
I'll have to actually search that out myself, Jonathan, but thank you for that recommendation. And Fumikas, what would you recommend the audience read if they like this book?
Well, I'll add to the Russian theme and suggest one of our previous books from Better Read Than Dead, Notes from Underground. I think that's definitely a really powerful book in its connections with The Foundation Pit. But if I were to go outside the Better Read Than Dead canon, there is a more contemporary example that I'd like to express, and that's the Matrix series, the actual the trilogy starring Keanu Reeves. I know that's something that a lot of our younger viewers may definitely have seen before. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. I think there's a lot of overlap in the themes between the movie series and the Foundation Pit, particularly with the idea of collectivization and central control, which limits individuality, which could be seen as the actual matrix itself, and also the idea of wholeness, which I've been touching on quite a bit throughout the podcast, which I see as seeing outside the matrix, if that makes sense. So seeing the greatness or the bigger picture, that's seeing outside the matrix. So there's a lot of overlap there, a lot of interplay that I think is very, very relevant and pertinent to the Foundation Pit, and I could not recommend it enough if you haven't watched it. And Keanu Reeves is great in that series as well, so I highly recommend.
Yeah, I actually haven't watched The Matrix in years, so I should go back and watch that. I think I will recommend what I touched on earlier in the show as being very similar to this. I felt, at least in style, which is Waiting for Godot. You can read it, but I would seek out a performance of it if it's anywhere near you. It generally comes around every few years in most capital cities. It's a play that I think everyone should see one time in their life, so I highly recommend that. But now we are coming to the end of our show. Jonathan, I would like to thank you so much for your time today. It was a real pleasure having you on the show. Is there anything that you would like to plug to our audience whilst you have them?
You know what? Well, I thank you for being the person to suggest that I read this book. I mean, it was such I want to say life-changing is a strong word, but it was an incredible book. So thank you. My latest book project with the rest of the Quillette staff is called Panics and Persecutions. If you look for that on Amazon, I think there are some themes discussed in Panics and Persecutions, which is about mob culture and the excesses of the social justice movement. I think, I dare say, Platonov himself might recognize some of the broad themes, even if we don't reach his high level of literary genius. So that's available on Amazon if anyone's interested.
Thank you so much for that, Jonathan, and I hope a lot of our audience goes out and seeks that new book.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
Peumike, can you just let our audience know how to get involved in book club if they are not a member yet?
Well, if you're not a member yet, go to generationliberty.org.au, sign up to our book club. If you're not a member, it's $10, but if you are a member of the illustrious Generation Liberty team, it's free. So I highly recommend you get on board and join us for some great discussions. That's at generationliberty.org.au.
That brings us to the end of our show this week. Thank you so much for listening. I really do hope that you get through the Foundation Pit, and please let us know what you think. Make sure you're following us on Instagram at Generation Liberty IPA and get involved in the discussion. And thank you for watching Better Read Than Dead.